Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure today to host this conversation with Tom Jorling. So I'm going to introduce Tom and give you a little background, and then we'll have a little conversation, and then we'll have questions from all of you. As you can see, we are recording this session, so whatever you say will be held for posterity. But we had a lot of interest from the EPA Alumni Association, which is a group of like 17,000 or something former EPA employees. And they asked if we could live stream. We said, well, we couldn't quite arrange that at that point, but that we would record it and make it available on the website, because anybody who has spent any time at EPA knows about the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act, and probably knows something about Tom Jorling. So that's very important. But I just want to give Todd Eisenstadt, who is my colleague in the Center for Environmental Policy and a professor of government, is teaching a course on climate change at the end of the semester, and just was going to tell you a few things about that in case some people are interested.
Yes, thank you. The Center for Environmental Policy and the Department of Government are thrilled to be offering our first Climate Institute this spring. And actually, it's at the end of the spring semester, but really, and this is important if you look in the course catalog, it's at the beginning of the summer session. Okay, so look under the summer session to register for Government 496, 696. What it is a 10-day 9 to 5 exposure to a whole range of issues relating to climate change, from the sort of international relations issues to the national policies, which I'm sure we're going to hear some more about today, to the economics of climate change, to social movements, to what we can do as individuals. It's a very comprehensive class that will involve a lot of group participation and a lot of community speakers, and in fact, some speakers who are going to be Zooming in will be coming from all over the world. So it's a really good opportunity that is being set up for the first time. It's a 3 or 4 credit course. There will be, if you do 4 credits, opportunities after the course for an independent study to be submitted later in the summer, working with some public agencies in the area that we have contact with. If you have questions, please email me again. My email, eisnsta@american.edu. Sorry to interrupt, but thanks. Do you mind if I just put that up?
Put it up, yeah, put it up, yeah.
I don't see it. There's one on the far side. Oh, on the far side. It's always on the far side. Excuse me.
Okay, so you can put that up, Todd, and we'll start. So if you like air that doesn't make you choke, and you like rivers and lakes that don't catch on fire or are full of pollution, you have many people to thank, but in large part you have this gentleman with us today to thank. Tom Jorling is from the great state of Ohio, so he's a fellow Buckeye, although from the other end of Ohio, from Cincinnati. Earned degrees from Washington State University in forest ecology, and a law degree from Boston University. Tom Jorling worked in the Interior Department, but then became, and this is the really important part of his experience for our purposes today, Minority Counsel for the Senate Committee on Public Works, and worked with several of their subcommittees, but especially the Air and Water Pollution Subcommittee. So that's where I think the air and water laws. He worked with Majority Counsel Leon Billings as a co-drafter of the 1970 Clean Air Act and the 1972 Clean Water Act. It had a fancier name, Federal Water Pollution Control Act amendments, but we all tend to call it the Clean Water Act today. Tom was an environmentalist, and he worked for a Republican senator. So it was a different time, I suppose, in those days. So Senator Muskie, of course, from Maine, chaired the subcommittee. He was the subcommittee chair, Tom?
Subcommittee chair.
Yeah. And Tom, you worked for Senator John Sherman Cooper.
Correct.
Yeah. Tom Jorling was the assistant administrator for water and hazardous materials at EPA, commissioner of the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, so that's the state environmental resources agency in New York, vice president for environmental affairs at International Paper Company, and a professor of environmental studies and director of the Center for Environmental Studies at Williams College in Massachusetts. So has had a range of experiences, and we're going to talk about those today, but we're going to talk a lot about what it was like in the late 1960s, early 1970s, when these really fundamental landmark environmental laws were passed. I sort of gave Tom a quick warning that I would do this, but there are a couple of articles that are very interesting about the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts, and there's one called The Making of the Clean Air Act, which was published in Hastings Law Journal in 2020. So just some comments about Leon Billings, his counterpart working on the Democratic side, and Tom Jorling. They were not only the work engines that translated the subcommittee's deliberations into concise statutory language and organized the agenda, they were also active participants at critical decision points, at times even being advocates for policy positions, generally granted considerable deference by full members of the subcommittee. Billings was, in his own words, the political guy who didn't know blank blank, this is a family university, about the environment, while Jorling was the environmentalist who had gone to law school and had some fixed ideas on what was wrong with public policy. So with your background in forest ecology, I guess that was sort of a relatively new thing in those days. So can we start, Tom, just what was the political climate at the time? What was it like working in Congress? What sort of things were going on?
Well, it's hard to look back at that time without looking at the climate that was surrounding it. One of the things that I usually do in a class like this is ask what major events occurred in 1968, which is the year I joined the committee staff and was influenced by this climate of upheaval that was going on in the United States at that time. So I joined the staff following the Martin Luther King assassination, and in between that assassination and the Robert Kennedy assassination, and several other activities that occurred in that period, which were the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, which produced one result, among many others, which was that President Johnson concluded that he would not run for re-election and made that announcement. And that triggered a flurry of activity on the Democratic side as to who would be the candidates for the 68 nomination. So it was a period of tremendous upheaval. Dan mentioned the Leon Billings. We not only became very close professional colleagues during that period, but very close personal friends, and which continued to his untimely death a couple of years ago. But we commuted together from Silver Spring, Maryland. All of you forget where I am. All of you are familiar with Silver Spring. And we would commute, and Leon had come to Washington from Montana, and he never really lost his Montana character. So he had a Ford F-100 pickup truck, and that's what we commuted back and forth in. During the period immediately after the King assassination, when this city was burning, literally, we could no longer commute by going out North Capitol, which is the typical route we would go, because the first time we tried it, we got bricks thrown through the windshield. So we had to spend the next several months commuting by going across the river, out George Washington Parkway to the Beltway, and come around that way. The city was occupied by the 82nd Airborne, so that when we would go into the office in the morning, there would be a sandbag machine gun emplacement at the doorway, and you'd say, "Good morning, Sergeant. How are you this morning?" So it was a period of tremendous upheaval. And it had some influence on the senators, especially those that I had the privilege of working for and with, about the business of being a United States senator and legislating. There was a sense of a perception that things were out of control and that government was not responsive. And there was a feeling, certainly in our committee, that it would be important to demonstrate that we can respond to major public policy issues. And that had some significant influence over the production of the Clean Air Act, first in 1970, and then 2 years later in 1972 was the Clean Water Act. So it was a very tumultuous time. I'm sure predecessor students to you were occupying, as students did during that period, occupying the corridors of the Senate office buildings and the House office buildings. So you would come, and this was the first exposure I had to a strange smelling substance. Coming in the morning, the corridors would be lined with students in sleeping bags, and they had been smoking pot all night. And so it was a period in which it was dominated by the protesting of the Vietnam War. And so a senator could not leave the privacy of their office without being besieged by protesters. From the time they walked out the door, down the corridor, up the elevator, they were being harassed by students protesting and demanding something happen to stop the war in Vietnam. So when they came to us in the committee office, it was a sanctuary, in effect. And Leon and I used to joke, we put together, well, I'm leaping around here a little bit in the chronology, but when we were finished with the public hearings, and we had some 30 plus public hearings on the Clean Air Act before we went into what is called markup, which is the period in which the senators actually make decisions about what the nature of the legislation would be. Well, those markups at that time were closed. And so they would come into this very small conference room, and usually in the initial stages that would be 9 members of the subcommittee, 5 Democrats and 4 Republicans, and it was a sanctuary. And so we would have an agenda of things to cover for what usually was scheduled for a 2-hour meeting. And when we would finish that agenda, they wouldn't leave. They would much prefer to talk about clean air than they would to go back outside that door and have to confront all these students that were demanding an end to the Vietnam War. So they spent hours and hours. I wrote a piece that appeared in the journal, the initial journal of the Natural Resources Defense Council, and I said, you know, I don't advocate another war to produce legislation, but the war did produce an opportunity for these members to concentrate, focus, and become very knowledgeable, and ultimately produced a document which, as Dan said, is a foundational document in environmental law. So it was a challenging time. Now, Leon and I were both young. I joined the committee staff when I was 28 years old. Leon joined 2 years earlier when he was 28. So we were filled with idealism, I guess, and optimism at that time. And we had the opportunity with the unusual group of men, they were all men at that time in the United States Senate, an opportunity to work with these individuals. They became extremely knowledgeable about both the history of efforts to address air pollution in this first case, and they became very understanding of what was deficient in earlier efforts. There had been several statutes enacted by Congress on clean air previously. Why didn't it work? It wasn't producing any significant change in the quality of the air. The air was continuing to deteriorate. So they became just very knowledgeable and also very committed to producing something that would, as Senator Eagleton would often say in the committee meetings, usually a statute enacted by Congress is more like a press release. It promises all this wonderful stuff, but it doesn't accompany those statements of purpose with the actual tools that will produce the change that's necessary. And so they began to focus on what is it going to be, what's it going to take the trend of continuing air pollution and take it down to at least levels to produce air quality that protects public health and welfare. So they became very, if we talk a little bit about some of the specifics of the Clean Air Act, which many of those elements were carried forth in the Clean Water Act, how do you craft a legislative authority to granting authority to an executive agency that will produce change? What do you have to do to create that framework that produces that outcome? And that's what they spent a lot of time on. And we'll probably come out with some of the pieces of the Clean Air Act that are considered very innovative and attach them to one or another specific senator and what it was that they were concerned about, and therefore supporting some of these very, what many people now call radical departures in regulatory authority. So it was just a dynamic time. It was before there was really any environmental movement. That comes along almost coincident with the enactment of the Clean Air Act. Natural Resources Defense Council, Environmental Defense Fund, both were started in 1970 by even younger people than Leon and I were, a group of law students at Yale University, graduated in 1970 and had a faculty advisor that said, well, maybe you should create some kind of a public interest law firm, and help them get some initial financing, and that financing then resulted in the creation of the Natural Resources Defense Council. So that previously the advocate community, if you even give it that kind of strength, that was more I don't know, you wouldn't call it advocacy in the kind of term we now use, but the NGO community at that time was limited to the old line conservation organizations, Isaac Walton League and National Wildlife Federation and those kinds of things. And they hadn't spent any time on pollution. They were more interested in the case of Isaac Walton, in making sure that the opportunity for recreational fishing was enhanced. But there was very little advocacy from the what we now call the non-governmental organizations. They learned a lot during this period. I remember one classic case after the subcommittee had reported its bill that was ultimately to become the Clean Air Act, and it had the provisions that created a statutory standard for the reduction of emissions of automobiles, 90% reduction over a base of 1970 auto emissions. And that caused some consternation, to say it mildly, in the automobile industry. And so we had a public hearing, and it wasn't conducted in this initial case by the senators, but by Leon and I. And the automobile industry was represented by a very notable Washington attorney by the name of Lloyd Cutler. And these young environmental groups came in and listened to this testimony. And during this testimony, Mr. Cutler would say, on page 14, between lines 6 and 7, we recommend that you insert this. And he would go through this one by one, and afterwards a couple of these fellows, Dick Ayers and Gus Beth, came up to me and they said, "Is that really how you have to advocate? You really have to know this stuff." And we responded, yes. If you're going to be an effective advocate, you've got to know it better than your opposition, and you've got to be able to make the case to support your position, like you observed from the representative of the automobile industry. Because at that time, I used to characterize it with this budding environmental advocacy group that were approaching us. I'd say, your approach is, God is great, God is good, give us a clean environment. You just said it's the way it should be. You should give us a clean environment. But you've got to go back into the detail of the legislation, and you have to understand it, what its strengths or weaknesses are, and you have to advocate on that level of detail. And if you don't, we're not going to get there from here. So it was a period of learning on many fronts, but the most important learnings were the members of the committee and the interaction that they had with each other over a long period of time. As I said, I can give you the numbers because the legislative process does not operate this way anymore. Where in the case of the Clean Air Act, we had 30 days of hearings over a period of about 8 months, and we went into markup and had 20 days of markup, which meant that this group of 9 senators committed 2+ hours of uninterrupted time in that very small conference room to go through the detail line by line of the legislation. That doesn't happen anymore. There's no public hearings on even major legislation that gets drafted in the majority leader's offices of the respective chambers. So it's a very different process, and we might come to some more detail on that. But it was a very, especially in retrospect, a very rewarding time. It was intense. The hours were long and detailed, and but it was, as I said, very, very rewarding time.
Yeah, both those laws I see did a lot of things, but 2 big things. They enhanced the role of the federal government over states, so that the federal government could, establish standards and rules that states had to follow once the federal government occupied that space, and expanded control over the economy in some pretty significant ways. So was there pushback either from sort of the state's perspective or from the industry perspective, and how did that work out?
Well, it was interesting, as you point out, the relationship with the states is crucial in a federal system like ours, but what we had the opportunity to do was draw on the progressive states. And in the case of air quality, air emissions, the state of California was leaps and bounds ahead of EPA, or what EPA hadn't been created yet, but the predecessor bureau in the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, it was called the National Air Quality Administration or something like that. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was a very inferior, qualitatively inferior group of people to the air quality programs in the state of California. So we drew extensively on the experience and knowledge of the state of California in approaching what was possible technologically and policy-wise on clean air. So we had at least some support from a state, and there were a couple of other states, one of which being New York, that wanted a strong federal platform. And I think a moments of reflection, you'd realize why that's important. And a progressive state on control did not want to be punished economically if other states were not going to be strong. And that leads to a dynamic that says the federal government has to establish a floor below which states can't go, so that you don't have the phenomenon of what colloquially can be called pollution havens. So a state would say, I'm going to attract industry to my state because we're going to have lax pollution control. So there had to be something, and the labor unions were very strong on this point. You couldn't create a statute which enabled states to use lax environmental controls to attract economic development. So that was an important component of how the structure of the Clean Air Act worked. So some of the states were opposed, partly because they just didn't think what, as it became clearer and clearer as the process went on, that were going to be very, very strong controls. They didn't see that they had the capability of doing that in their states, and so they were somewhat cautious about that. You can imagine, for instance, when the provision on non-deterioration, which means the Clean Air Act could not operate to allow the deterioration of good air quality to certain floor levels. It had to protect high quality air. Many of the states were very concerned about that kind of a provision, that you're locking us into less economic development than those states, big industrial states, have already achieved. So you see some of the tensions that occur when you're writing legislation that creates costs, in many cases differential costs, across the economy and across the multiple states. So those tensions obviously have to be worked out in the process, and somehow judged a little bit about how far are you willing to go in order to achieve whatever national objective you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, so California, I know, was the model, as you pointed out, for air, and you could build around that. Was there any sort of equivalent to California in the water law? And any states that you looked at and said, oh, those are some good examples of what maybe we can do?
There were, not quite to the extent and not quite with the specificity. The University of California, Riverside, the University of California at UCLA, and Caltech, they were the source of any knowledge on the technology of autos. They still are. If you go to the University of California, Riverside, most of the staff on the faculty drive not just electric cars, but what's the other technology?
Fuel cell?
Yeah, fuel cells. They're driving fuel cell cars. So they're still well in advance, even though the federal government has caught up in many respects. On water, there was no single state that matched that kind of relationship we had with California on air. But there were several states that were very good at that time: Michigan, Minnesota, New York, state of Washington. They had adopted programs that not only accomplished good things, but they had staff that were more advanced than the staff at the federal government level. So there were states that we drew upon. On the other hand, there were also some states that were very strongly opposed to federal intervention in water pollution. They considered that their sacrosanct area. One time, Leon and I went down to visit with some professors at the University of Texas in Austin. They had a good program on sort of the technology of municipal waste control. And we also took that opportunity to visit with some of the people in the state capitol in their water program. And when we went in the door, the head of that program came up to us and said, "Why are you here? I don't want anybody from the federal government in this state." That continues on to today, but that attitude that we don't want the federal government anywhere near Texas. But it does reflect some of the different challenges you have in trying to look at this array of 50 states and trying to come up with a program that's going to accomplish your ultimate objective and do it fairly and in ways that no state suffers an inordinate challenge. So water was a little bit different than air in that California was so far superior.
Yeah. So looking back, literally a half century, in the case of the Clean Water Act and a bit more in the place of the Clean Air Act, looking back, are there things that you wish had been in either of those laws based on what we've learned since? Anything if you could go back and sort of do it over again, that you would do differently?
Clean air, there's nothing that I would point to as sort of a major either omission or a commission that wasn't working. On water, there's some challenges that are quite a bit different. I know in clean air and clean water, we had to face constitutional challenges. What is the authority under the Constitution to control air pollution? It's an interesting parlor discussion game. Come up with a theory that will pass. Fortunately, we were passing a Supreme Court that was a little bit better than the current Supreme Court. On water, it's even a more difficult challenge. Where does the federal government get authority to, under the Constitution, to regulate what now we call the waters of the United States? The previous federal legislation covered what was called interstate waters, and that was literally the purview of the federal legislation, only interstate waters. So only waters that flowed from one state through another state could be subject to federal jurisdiction. So the committee had to grapple with this notion of how do we come up with a theory, a constitutional theory that will withstand muster, that will cover, that the regulatory authority will cover the hydrologic system and do it constitutionally. We didn't know what the answer to that was going to be. What Leon and I always considered is our ultimate professor, the judge of our work, was the Supreme Court. And how is this going to pass muster through the Supreme Court? And on waters of the United States, I can tell you we were very nervous when the Swansea case, I think it was the first of the waters of the United States, and actually it was Justice Scalia that wrote the majority opinion. And we approached that when we heard that the ruling had been issued. What did he do? And fortunately, even Scalia upheld the basic extension of authority of the federal government to cover the waters of the United States. Some issues on that are still before the Supreme Court in a different context, but those issues are very difficult to deal with, and you're in effect betting the farm when you make a choice. And what's the Supreme Court going to say ultimately about this? Now, in retrospect, there have been many legal scholars that have looked at all of the appellate level and Supreme Court level cases on both the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act, and the balance is way better for upholding both statutes. There are some important cases now pending, which are testing whether that balance will continue. But we considered what the Supreme Court said about these statutes as our judge. Did we do a good job with the language? And the way we used to test it is, and this is a good one for students, if you write something prescriptive and give it to 10 people, will 10 people have exactly the same understanding of what you wrote? That was our test. How do you get as many people as possible to read your language and have exactly the same understanding of what it says? It's a very challenging burden to do that, because it's the ultimate test. Your words aren't going to be actionable until the courts ultimately say those words mean what they say. And so hopefully writing them in a way that they're understandable the same way by lots of different people is the ultimate test.
Yeah, one more point before we ask for questions from everybody else, but the U.S. does not have a climate mitigation law, a national law. There have been various, well, there was the Massachusetts versus EPA decision that said, yeah, the Clean Air Act could grant authority. What are your thoughts on, can the Clean Air Act help us deal with climate mitigation? Where do you think the law stands on that? And I know you've been working on a brief for the West Virginia versus EPA case, which is going to be a potentially big deal. Very big deal. I guess the way of framing that question is, does the Clean Air Act have the capability of addressing climate change? And we won't try and lay out the whole argument because it's exceedingly complicated. But what Massachusetts case did was rule that carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases are air pollutants. Therefore, the authorities of the Clean Air Act addressing air pollutants are available to address climate change. But then the question is, you go to the tools. What are the tools in the Clean Air Act, the regulatory tools that you can implement or apply to the release of greenhouse gases? And there, the question is one of interpretation, and therefore the courts are ultimately going to decide it. And the case, the West Virginia case, is the way it's going to be decided. Now, separately, that issue is can only be speculated about in light of the current Supreme Court. As Dan said, I've worked on an amicus brief. Actually, Leon and I did a joint amicus brief when it was at a lower court level. So I've written an amicus brief in which I lay out the case that this is the proper interpretation of the Clean Air Act and apply it to the release of greenhouse gases. But in dealing with that, when you write an amicus brief, you have to have counsel. And I've had counsel, a whole series of law professors from California, actually, that assisted me in writing this brief. And they came from Berkeley and UCLA. And I can tell you that I was somewhat deflated to hear what their view of what was going to happen in the Supreme Court. And their view is that this particular Supreme Court, as currently constituted, isn't going to rule in a narrow sense on that issue, whether this Section 111D can be used to address controls
the language is best systems of control available or not. These professors who are very progressive want the tightest environmental controls possible, but they said, Tom, don't be under any disillusion, or don't be disillusioned. This court's not going to rule in favor. They're going to rule against us. But that's not the real issue. The question is, how much damage are they going to do to the Environmental Protection Agency and to the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act in writing the opinion that they're going to write? That's going to be the real question, because there are several members of the court that have already spoken that they want to basically emasculate EPA and across the board. They want to basically say that only statutes which speak specifically to something can be approved. You can't say to EPA, write a regulation defining the best available technology, because that's an unlawful grant of authority to EPA. You've got to say what the technology is that you want applied. And so the only thing that would pass muster in that view, and it's the view we think of a majority of the members, is the auto emission standard, that 90% reduction is what's required. That level of specificity is required in a statute, and they're going to basically greatly diminish EPA's authority to write regulations based on language that is not specific in that sense. So just saying best systems of technology, that's unlawful, because that's too much discretion in the agency. Only Congress can define what is the best system of technology. So they're going to be prepared, or I think all of us are being prepared for some decisions that are going to radically change the character of the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act.
Yeah, that will be a profound change. And actually, I think one of the prominent exponents of that point of view on the court is the son of a former EPA administrator.
Yes, it
Is that correct? Yes. Okay, so your questions or thoughts for Tom Jorling. Why don't we, Josh?
Yeah, so I know EPA has two standards for air quality, or I know specifically with PM, there's primary and secondary standards. Always had trouble understanding the secondary standards and like social welfare. Can you kind of elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, the secondary standard is the welfare standard. So if the Act defines welfare in a very broad term, and it was written to address the fact that it's not just public health that is affected, human public health that's affected by air pollutants. There are other critters on the planet, vegetation, other animals, that are affected at different levels than humans are affected, and that those elements of the ecosystem should also be protected, and that's the secondary standard's objective. Now, in contrast to the primary standard, the health standard, the secondary standard has a lot of latitude as to what you can do and how long you can do, how long it would take to get to that objective. So the secondary standard had a much higher evidentiary level to establish, because you had to do a lot more ecological research instead of human health research. One of the things about human health research that I know when I first went to the Cincinnati lab, EPA's Cincinnati lab, where they do a lot of health effects research, is walking into a room about this size, and around the wall were all these primates, monkeys, breathing through face masks, gas masks, and they were being tested for different levels of exposure to different air pollutants. And that's we don't experiment with humans And so, at least I can tell you that that issue came up in our administration in 1978. A New York Times reporter called Doug Counsel, who was the administrator, and said, "We're working on a story that says that EPA is doing experimental research on humans." And Doug brought the group together and said, "Are we?" And it turns out what the sort of transition area where what is experimentation on a human, and what kinds are acceptable and what kinds aren't. For instance, we wouldn't put humans in that room, putting the face mask on them and breathing through, breathing different concentrations of gases. Although I know previously at EPA, you could go make, if you wanted $25 to get a ski pass, you'd go give blood. Well, a lot of students were asked to come in to EPA, and they would get on treadmills and breathe different concentrations of carbon dioxide or carbon monoxide. And is that an experiment on a human? So there are some really threshold questions in there, but it did lead us to adopt a policy that the agency did not conduct or support research on humans. So that's a kind of challenge, but even with that, so you're mostly relying on epidemiological research, and that's why so much epidemiological research is done in Utah, because a lot of the confounding factors that affect human health, like alcohol and smoking and things, which are supposed to be forbidden in the Mormon religion, so much epidemiological work is done there. But direct research is difficult. It's got a different set of ethical questions. But the problem with the welfare standard is that's exceedingly difficult research to ferret out what are the causes of a particular adverse effect on vegetation or another critter, and establishing that causal relationship in order to set that standard. Ozone's a little bit easier, and that's why so many roadways you see the browned out vegetation because of ozone concentrations along highways. But it's a much harder concept to get your hands around and write a standard that is going to cause somebody to change their behavior.
Josh?
So it was interesting
Alex, sorry.
Hearing you're discussing sit-ins and protests during '68. I'm curious if you think that such kind of methods would be effective today in kind of ushering in environmental legislation, especially given the kind of current political polarization and misinformation that's utilized. Or do you think that other kind of means would be maybe more effective by the average citizen?
Well, it's a political process, and a political process is influenced by perceptions by elected officials of where the public is. Now, how do you measure that? Certainly in the case of Vietnam, it was obvious that there was a massive discontent with the conduct of that war, and that led to physically occupying the office buildings on the Capitol. Does it require that again to address? I think there are other methods, and I usually start with vote. The worst voting behavior is in the ages of 18 to 25. Something like 30% of 18-year-olds to 25-year-olds vote. If you're not even voting, no amount of protest is going to influence an elected official. So you got to start with voting. Now, that leads to engagement in the political processes, the electoral processes, very actively. But as far as whether or not the kind of protests that we experienced in '68, those were unusual days. I mean, following the 2 assassinations, coupled to Vietnam, we were on a razor's edge, and I don't think those kinds of protests. I hope things don't occasion in the country that kind of protest, of burning of the cities and what have you. So, but active engagement in political processes, absolutely. There's no shortcut to that. You have to convince an elected official that there are people out there that could balance my reelection on this issue, and they've got to experience it, they've got to feel it, they've got to witness it, and that means a lot of engagement in the political processes.
Yeah, there's like a lot of work done in the clear water and also clean air, like as you were talking about California. I was working on a project last semester, and there was a company called Ada, like from Sweden, and they developed like a software which was like installing in the HVAC system for improving the indoor air quality. And I saw an article, and the author said that from 1972 up to 2018, till he was writing the article, he said that there was like different kind of like mandates and regulations for the outdoor air quality, and the outdoor air quality improved, like the pollution increased up to 72%, but the indoor air quality remained relatively the same, because it was just guidelines and suggestions. It was not mandated. Do you think that indoor air quality should be mandated and regulated as outdoor quality is? And if yes, so who will take steps? Like, what is the responsibility? Like, it's like government, is it Congress, or like is it general people? Because you are mentioning that like indoor air quality, like in the malls, in the like data center, distribution centers, like the indoor air quality is still threat to the human health. So what do you think? There's like necessity to be like the indoor quality also be regulated and mandated?
To indoor quality. Well, it asks this kind of a question. You'd start, where is the constitutional authority for the federal government to regulate indoor air quality? Is there any? And you can probably craft an argument, yes, there is. There'd be a counter argument that there's not. We do have federal authority under OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Act, to regulate workplace air quality. But we have not, we've not got any activity in EPA or elsewhere that says you should, there should be monitoring for and levels set that air quality indoor should be established at the federal level. Some states have done some of that, but it's an interesting conceptual challenge to say, what kind of a statute would you write at the federal level to regulate indoor air quality? I think you could craft one, but it would lead to the reaction, well, the people that are going to be responsible for providing indoor air quality don't have any ability to control the things that contribute to air quality problems indoor. It's the people that make furniture, it's the people that make carpeting, it's all of the, how do you get at that is a tougher set of issues. I think you could craft it, be an interesting exercise to see if you could come up with a way of creating federal authority for regulating indoor quality, but it's not there. We're not there yet.
Yeah, that's, I remember in the 1980s, EPA did a project. It was called the Unfinished Business Report. Tracy probably remembers this. And the idea was to look at all the remaining risks that were out there And indoor air quality came up pretty high on the list, saying, well, gee, we've made all these improvements in ambient air quality outdoors, but what about indoors? And particularly when people got concerned about energy efficiency and designing buildings so that they could retain heat or cold, it became more of an issue. But yeah, that's an interesting question.
Well, one of the achievements that bears a little bit on that, not quite directly, but Dan, a person that you've had engagement with here, Bill Riley, when he was administrator of EPA, took a very bold decision, and it was to declare secondary smoke as a carcinogen, but it was more than that. It was subject to regulation. So that is as close as the federal government has gotten to sort of indoor issues with was secondary smoke or secondary exposures from cigarette smoking. But other than that, it's a real challenge. Now, some states have tried to do this, especially in the building codes required as we do move to more efficient housing or structures, because that's a serious issue. And I know that led some tentative steps in the Consumer Product Safety Commission to include off-gassing from products like furniture, fabrics, and carpeting and the like. But I don't think that's moved to a robust regulatory program.
Other questions? Danielle?
Thank you. So, Tom, you mentioned the potential threat of the West Virginia versus EPA ruling that will come out of this Supreme Court, which is a frightening scenario. What would it take, in your mind, for Congress to bolster the Clean Air Act such that whatever ruling comes about could be then mitigated? That's a big question.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately it'll vary with what the court does say, but it's going to be very difficult. We can't even get Congress now to act on anything in a meaningful way, so that reliance on Congress is going to be a weak read to look at. But it depends on really how far they go with this non-delegation doctrine, and it's going to come probably on June 1st or something like that, along with several other major decisions that are going to challenge what a lot of us have expected to be settled law. And if that decision came down with the Congress that I worked for, I would feel confident that they would come back with a good response. I don't have that confidence now. So I just don't know what we're looking at. A pretty challenging period ahead of us. Very challenging period.
Yeah, Tom, your experience showed that a group of legislators could work together on a bipartisan basis and draft laws, and these laws were passed with overwhelming majorities. I forget the exact numbers, but I mean there were like in the House, the Clean Air Act were there maybe just a few dissenting votes or something?
Yeah, I thought I had those numbers here.
Even the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments, which were very substantial, I think it was like 90% to 10%, something like that.
The
It's
Senate
hard to
passed,
imagine that happening now.
No,
Yeah.
it wouldn't happen.
So what do you, has the country changed, or the problems changed, or what do you think's going on?
Well, one of the things that when Leon and I would get together in the period, we both followed very different courses geographically as well as professionally, but always involved with environment in one way or another. We'd get together and we realized we were all each being asked the same question, some variation of this question. Why did the legislative process work then and it doesn't work now?
Yeah.
And we got together in New York City and we wrote up what we perceived to be the differences that bear on that question. And we came up with something like 48 different things. And we reduced it down to about 20 because some of them were different ways of stating the same issue. Then the questions we were asked when we offered this course at the various places, and they'd say, well, what are you going to do about it? I mean, is it possible that it'll ever restore, that this will ever be restored? And I advised Leon. Leon had never done teaching before. I had been teaching at Williams, and I said, you know, the most difficult challenge for a professor is to convey the situation, information, the reasoning, all that, without discouraging the optimism of the next generation. And it's a very difficult challenge, and it's getting more difficult each time we sort of move in this direction. So it's there are a number of things that have changed very dramatically. Will it ever be restored? That's the question. And among our answers were it's the difference between what we see now and what the people we worked for is the character of the people involved. And the character of elected officials has changed dramatically. And then that leads to a whole series. Why? What are some of the factors that are influencing that? And I could go through my list, but among them are the things that you have to do to be elected now. The people that we work for could not. They just philosophically, personally couldn't engage in that kind of activity. They just wouldn't do it. And that's a problematic issue. For instance, one of the things that an elected official now has to do, a member of the House of Representatives has to raise on average $10,000 a day during his 2-year term in order to run for re-election. A senator from a major state has to raise more like $50,000 a day for 6 years in order to run for re-election or to run for election. Well, how do you do that? Well, the way it's done is that every day the people from the campaign hand a card to their patron, and that person has to go over to the Republican National Campaign offices or the Democratic campaign offices, where they have special rooms all lined up, because member of Congress can't raise money in their personal or in their legislative offices or in their personal office. They have to go to the political chambers to do that. And so they get that card and it says, here are the 5 people you that have called today to raise money. Well, that's a hard thing for people to do. So how do you do it? Well, one of the things you do is you benefit from the fact that we now have the 24/7 cable TV. And FaceTime is very important to raising money. So the more time you get as a talking head on TV feeds your money machine. So that sort of causes these people not to be interested in legislating. They wouldn't spend all the hours that our members spent going through the Clean Air Act, day after day after day. No, they're raising money. You don't get rewarded for legislating anymore. You don't get rewarded at all for that in the electoral process. So these things sort of all feed together to prevent the kind of people. The members that we worked for, they were elected to legislate. That's what they considered to be their responsibility. The members now, legislation is not even on their horizon. They don't do it. It's just a very different arena. And so you ask yourself, what are they running for? Why do they want to be an elected official? And the basic answer is they become celebrities and they enjoy the celebrity lifestyle. It's just people fawning all over them all the time. It's just a very different group. There are so many elements to this that I could spend time going through, but it's just very different now.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
talked about sad things tonight, like the Supreme Court and the state of the character of our elected officials. I'm curious, like, if you could outline like the best case scenario, or like how do you think things could be fixed in regard to all of this?
That's a
Or is
that's the $64 billion question.
or
It's
if you want to maybe just like address one element of that, like since we're all students and I'm probably optimists, I'm guessing.
I think it starts with the basics, getting engaged in the legislative, or getting engaged in the political processes, running for office, among them, not sort of declining to engage in every aspect of the political process, and also holding up people to some higher standards of performance in elective office.
Yeah.
You know, I just let me read you a statement that Howard Baker. Now, Howard Baker was a Republican.
How many of you heard of Howard Baker, besides Tracy and me?
Yeah. Oh, that's sad. And one of the things that I did do, I went back and looked up in Wikipedia to every member on the subcommittee and to see the descriptions. And in those descriptions, there's not one word that this person contributed to the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act. It's not in Wikipedia. So you just, you wonder, what is our value system? But Howard Baker is a senator, a Republican senator from Tennessee. He not only was a senator and majority leader in the Senate for many years, he became the chief of staff to Ronald Reagan for a period of time. He became the ambassador to Japan. I mean, he's had a very distinguished career. And during remarks that he made at the opening of the Howard Baker Institute of Public Policy at the University of Tennessee, he's obviously from Tennessee, he made some remarks. And in those remarks, he recounted the career of Thomas Jefferson. And he said, I'm not pretending that my public service is anything approached Thomas Jefferson. But he said, Thomas Jefferson said one thing. I want on my tombstone only one thing. I founded the University of Virginia. And so Howard Baker says, the only thing I want on my tombstone is he wrote the Clean Air Act. So you just don't see that pride in performance as a legislator from these people. It was a very different time. Why we've lost some of the elements of that is more speculation. But I can tell you that the way they interacted with each other, the same set of remarks he talks about his relationship with Muskie. And I should say that those of you that have studied anything on the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, you know one element that's dramatic in it is technology forcing. Howard Baker is the prime mover on technology forcing. That he had a great relationship with Muskie, very respectful and in every dimension. Jim Buckley, that's a name. If you didn't know Baker, you don't know Jim Buckley.
Yeah.
Except some of you may know his brother, who was a conservative political commentator, Bill Buckley. He got on the committee right before the Clean Water Act, and he participated in it very vigorously. And in the Senate report, he wrote some separate comments. And in those comments, he said, in no activity of human endeavor would I have been treated as well as I've been treated as a member of this committee. So and he actually served as the co-floor leader in the Senate on the adoption of the Clean Water Act. So if you go to the question, what kind of people, why did they do that? It was a very different time. I can tell you, I'll close with a couple of anecdotes about that measure this. Senator Cooper, really a great American, a distinguished person, told a story. He said he was running for re-election in Kentucky as a Republican senator at the same year that John Kennedy was running for president, 1960. And he said that Kennedy was flying from Chicago to a political event in Louisville, Kentucky. And on the plane, Kennedy was asking about, well, what's the event like, who's going to be there, and that kind of stuff. And they gave him a sheet that said, here's who's going to be on the dais with you. And Kennedy goes through it, and he said, Democratic candidate for Senate against Cooper. Kennedy takes his pen out, strikes that name, said, the person who's running against my friend John Sherman Cooper will not be on the podium with me. So that just doesn't happen now. Now it's so bitterly personal and bitterly contested that you don't see that. When I was asked by Senator Cooper to consider becoming the counsel to the committee, I said to him, I grew up in a very active Democratic family in Ohio. I don't know whether that would work. And he said, that isn't a problem. But I was still concerned. So they called up again, and he said, well, come up and I'll introduce you around to Senator Randolph, Senator Muskie, Senator Eagleton, some of the other Democratic senators. And I walked into his office. Now then, again, this goes back to 68, early 68. And everybody in his office, a Republican senator's office, was wearing Gene McCarthy buttons. And I said, what is this? You know, here's a Democratic candidate for president on the Democratic side, and his entire staff, of Republican senators' staff, is wearing Gene McCarthy buttons. So it reflects that. Another case, Senator Baker was running for re-election in Tennessee, and his opponent, his Democratic opponent, approached Muskie's office, and Muskie, please endorse me. And Muskie said, I will not endorse that person. They said, well, you send us a picture. No, I'm not going to contribute to running against my friend Howard Baker.
Yeah.
So what explains that? It is explained by some shared values. It's explained by respect and trust. In these sessions, these markup sessions that lasted endlessly, these people got to know each other's character and developed or didn't develop a certain amount of trust with each other, and they respected each other. So it's more human interaction and engagement and character than it is any sort of magic way that you can say, change this and you'll change the political system back to that. It's the people that were engaged in it. Now, another thing that this gets back to some sort of extension of the comments before, all but one of those 9 members were veterans of the Second World War. And that had an effect on them. There's no politics in war. There used to be, anyway. No politics in war. There is now, but They also experienced, and this gets to Howard Baker's pushing technology and forcing technology. They experienced during this same period, put a man on the moon, and indeed 8 years later, there's a man on the moon. That we can do whatever we need to do in order to accomplish something. So they had a very different orientation towards this. Howard Baker was a very close friend of the person named Alvin Weinberg, who ran the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. Oak Ridge National Laboratory in Tennessee is the place where nuclear bombs were created. But it also was a very substantial physics laboratory. And Alvin Weinberg actually has written a classic piece in Science back then called Hobson's Choice about whether the society should adopt nuclear energy or not. But he and Baker were close friends, and Weinberg basically had the view that if the government says this should be achieved, the research and development community will respond and achieve it. And I give one last anecdote just to give some confirmation. One of the things Leon and I, and even members of the committee, were very surprised about is how resistant to innovation American corporations are. And during one of the very tense periods in negotiating the Clean Air Act, especially the automotive side of it, I had to go to the John during one of these sessions with the chief executive officers of the 4 manufacturers. At that time there were 4. And I went to the men's room, and one of the technical people from General Motors, as it turns out, had to go the same time I did. We're standing at the urinal, and he said to me, he said, "We can build whatever you tell us to build." And so it's there. At that time, GM had the car that they're now producing. And if you've ever seen the movie, it's called something about...
Who killed the electric car?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
who killed the electric... They had that car in 1970. But they killed it. They produced about 600 of them. They wouldn't sell them, but they allowed somebody to lease them. And in the course of that lease, they would communicate with the people that were operating it. It was so popular that GM called them back and destroyed them. Why did they do that? They could have dominated the market well before Tesla ever was a gleam in what's his name's eye.
That's true, yeah. It was also the late 60s. Despite everything that was going on, it was a period of very high confidence in government and government institutions. And I think that may explain why it was possible too. So we'll have to wrap up here. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Tom, for making the trip here, talking with us. Tom is also doing an interview tomorrow. The Center for Environmental Filmmaking in the School of Communications is doing a film on in honor of the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act. So Tom is going to be interviewed for that. So thank you for joining us today. Thank you for what you've done for the environment and for our country. And it's just great having you here.
Well, just get engaged, and you can accomplish great things. So.
It sounds like personal relationships are the key.
Yeah,
Yep.
they're important.
Thank you so much.
All right.